The morning of December 20th, 1941, broke clear and cold over Kunming, China. 10 Nakajima Ki-27 bombers of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service approached the vital terminus of the Burma Road, expecting another unopposed bombing run. For months, Japanese aircraft had pounded Chinese cities with impunity, their lightweight fighters dancing through the sky like deadly butterflies. But as the formation closed on its target, something unprecedented happened. For shark-mouthed fighters dove from the sun, their Allison V-17-10 engines screaming as they plummeted toward the Japanese bombers. These were Curtiss P-40 Warhawks of the American Volunteer Group, and they were about to shatter Japan's illusion of air superiority in the most dramatic fashion possible. Within minutes, four Japanese bombers were spinning toward the Earth in flames. The survivors, their formation shattered, jettisoned their bombs short of the target and fled for home. More would crash land before reaching base. Claire Lee Chenault had told his Flying Tigers that if they could shoot down 1/4 of any attacking force, the Japanese would not return. He was right. Kunming would not see another major Japanese air raid. This engagement marked the beginning of one of World War II's most remarkable stories, how an aircraft dismissed as obsolete by its own military would become the backbone of Allied air power in the war's darkest hours, producing over 200 fighter aces and earning grudging respect from every Axis power it faced. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was born from desperation and compromise in 1938, when the United States Army Air Corps faced the terrifying reality that its fighter force was hopelessly outclassed by new European designs. The sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Supermarine Spitfire had demonstrated performance levels that made American fighters look like museum pieces. At Curtiss-Wright Corporation's sprawling complex in Buffalo, New York, Chief Engineer Donovan Berlin faced an impossible deadline. The Air Corps needed a modern fighter immediately, but developing an entirely new aircraft would take years they didn't have. Berlin's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Take the existing P-36 Hawk airframe and made it to the most powerful engine available, the Allison V-17-10 inline power plant. The transformation was remarkable. The P-36's radial engine was replaced with the sleek inline Allison, its blunt nose giving way to a predatory profile dominated by the distinctive chin-mounted radiator intake. The liquid-cooled engine's narrow frontal area promised a theoretical 5% increase in top speed, while its smooth power delivery would give pilots the predictable performance they needed in combat. On October 14, 1938, Curtiss test pilot Edward Elliott lifted the prototype XP-40 into the autumn sky above Buffalo for its maiden flight. The aircraft that emerged from that first test program was a study in contradictions, fast enough to catch most contemporary fighters, yet lacking the high-altitude supercharger that would become essential for European combat. Rugged enough to absorb tremendous punishment, yet vulnerable to the nimble fighters of Japan. Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey, the Air Corps' fighter projects officer, flew the prototype 300 miles in 57 minutes, approximately 315 miles per hour. Though he privately harbored disappointments about the aircraft's top speed, Kelsey recognized its potential. The V-12 engine offered as much power as contemporary radials but with better aerodynamics, and most critically, the P-40 could be manufactured quickly using existing P-36 production tooling. In May 1939, following competitive trials against other pursuit prototypes, the Air Corps declared the XP-40 most acceptable and ordered 524 aircraft. It was a decision born of pragmatism rather than enthusiasm. The P-40 wasn't the best fighter on the drawing board, but it was the best fighter they could get into squadron service before the war arrived. The first production P-40s rolled off Curtiss-Wright's assembly line in March 1940, powered by Allison V-17-10 39 engines producing 1,150 horsepower. These early aircraft were lightly armed by later standards, carrying just two 50-caliber machine guns mounted above the engine and four 30-caliber guns in the wings. More importantly, they lacked pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, deficiencies that would prove costly in the coming war. As 1941 dawned, the P-40 was America's first-line fighter, equipping pursuit squadrons from the Philippines to Iceland. By any objective measure, it was already becoming obsolescent, outclassed by the latest German fighters in Europe, and soon to meet Japanese aircraft whose performance capabilities remained largely unknown to American intelligence. Yet the P-40 would prove that raw performance statistics told only part of the story. In the hands of skilled pilots who understood its strengths and limitations, this supposedly obsolete fighter would achieve one of the most remarkable combat records in aviation history. The first hint of the P-40's true potential came not from American pilots, but from their enemies. In the windswept airfields of North Africa, Luftwaffe pilots were discovering that the latest Allied fighter posed challenges they hadn't anticipated. Hauptmann Werner Schroer of Jägerschwader 27 was one of the Luftwaffe's rising aces when he first encountered British Tomahawks over the Western Desert in August 1941. With 26 kills to his credit, Schroer was confident in his Messerschmitt Bf 109 superiority over any Allied fighter he might meet. On August 29, Schroer and his wingmen spotted a lone Tomahawk far below, apparently unaware of their presence. It was a textbook bounce, two experienced German pilots with altitude advantage against a single Allied fighter. Schroer rolled into his attack, expecting a quick kill to add to his growing tally. The pilot of that Tomahawk was Flying Officer Clive Caldwell of No. 250 Squadron, Royal Air Force, an Australian who would become one of the war's most successful P-40 aces. As the Messerschmitt's dove, Caldwell did something that surprised Schroer. Instead of turning to flee or climbing to meet the attack, he dove away at full throttle, then pulled up sharply as the German fighters committed to their firing passes. What followed was a 20-minute dogfight that shattered German assumptions about Allied fighter capabilities. Caldwell's Tomahawk absorbed over 107.9 mm bullets and 5 20 mm cannon shells, yet remained airworthy. More shocking to Schroer, the Australian pilot's aggressive maneuvering and accurate gunnery forced the German ace into increasingly desperate evasion. When Caldwell's guns finally found their mark, Schroer's wingmen spiraled down in flames. Schroer himself barely escaped, his Messerschmitt riddled with 50 caliber holes as he limped back to base. The engagement left him stunned. Not only had a supposedly inferior Allied fighter survived concentrated fire from two Bf 109s, but its pilot had demonstrated tactical skills that matched anything the Luftwaffe could offer. The German pilot's after-action report filtered up through Luftwaffe intelligence channels, eventually reaching the desk of General der Flieger Hans Seidmann, commander of Fliegerkorps 10 in North Africa. Seidmann's staff had been tracking similar encounters with increasing concern. The new Allied fighter, designated Tomahawk by the British but clearly an American design, was proving far more capable than intelligence estimates suggested. Unlike the Hurricane, which German pilots had learned to defeat through superior altitude performance and diving attacks, the Tomahawk seemed to excel in exactly those flight regimes where German fighters held advantages. Its diving speed exceeded that of the Bf 109, while its structural strength allowed it to pull out of dives that would tear the wings off lighter fighters. Most disturbing of all, the Tomahawk's 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower at ranges where German cannon were ineffective. Oberst Eduard Neumann, commander of Jägerschwader 27, issued new tactical directives based on these encounters. German fighters were instructed to avoid prolonged engagements with Tomahawks at low altitude, where the American fighters' advantages were most pronounced. Instead, Messerschmitt pilots should use their superior climb rate and service ceiling to maintain altitude advantage, engaging only when conditions favored a quick diving attack followed by immediate disengagement. These tactical adjustments reflected a grudging respect for the P-40's combat capabilities. As one German pilot noted in his diary, the Tomahawk may not be the fastest fighter over the desert, but it is certainly one of the most dangerous. Its pilot sits behind armor plate, his fuel tanks are self-sealing, and his guns can reach out and kill you from distances where our weapons are useless. The gradual replacement of Hurricanes by Tomahawks and the improved Kitty Hawk variant led the Luftwaffe to accelerate retirement of the older Bf 109E model and introduce the more capable Bf 109F. These newer fighters, flown by veteran pilots of elite units like JG-27, were specifically deployed to counter the growing threat posed by American-built fighters in Allied hands. Even with improved aircraft and tactics, German pilots found the P-40 a formidable opponent when properly employed. At low to medium altitudes, where most air combat in North Africa occurred, the American fighter could hold its own against anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. Its advantages in diving speed, structural strength, and firepower often offset the Messerschmitt's superiority in climb rate and operational ceiling. By late 1942, Luftwaffe intelligence assessments ranked the P-40 as a more dangerous opponent than the Hurricane, though still inferior to the Spitfire and the twin-engine P-38 Lightning. This evaluation would prove remarkably prescient as American P-40 units began arriving in the Mediterranean theater with tactics specifically designed to maximize the aircraft's strengths. The 325th Fighter Group, known as the Checkertails for their distinctive yellow and black tail markings, arrived in North Africa in April 1943 equipped with P-40LS and a tactical doctrine that would revolutionize fighter combat in the Mediterranean theater. Under the command of Colonel Robert Basiler, the group's pilots had been trained to fight as disciplined formations, using coordinated attacks to overwhelm individual German fighters through superior numbers and firepower. On July 1, 1943, 22 Checkertail P-40s were conducting a fighter sweep over southern Italy when they were bounced by 40 Messerschmitt Bf 109GS of Jägerschwader 77. The German pilots, confident in their numerical advantage and aircraft performance, expected a relatively straightforward engagement against the slower American fighters. What they encountered instead was a masterpiece of coordinated fighter tactics. The P-40 pilots, rather than scattering under attack, maintained formation integrity and used their superior firepower to break up German attack formations. When individual Messerschmitts committed to firing passes, they found themselves targeted by multiple P-40s, their concentrated 50 caliber fire proving devastatingly effective at close range. The engagement lasted 45 minutes and resulted in 20 German aircraft shot down for the loss of a single P-40. More importantly, it demonstrated that properly trained and tactically sound P-40 units could not only survive but dominate engagements against supposedly superior German fighters. Similar results were achieved on July 30th when 35 Bf 109GS ambushed 20 P-40s over Italy. Once again, German numerical superiority proved ineffective against disciplined American tactics and concentrated firepower. The Checkertails shot down 18 German fighters while losing only 2 of their own aircraft. These engagements forced a fundamental reassessment of the P-40 within Luftwaffe circles. No longer could German pilots assume that their aircraft's superior performance guaranteed victory. The American fighter, while still limited by its poor high-altitude capabilities, had evolved into a formidable weapon system when employed by well-trained pilots using sound tactical doctrine. General Major Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighter aircraft, reviewed combat reports from the Mediterranean with growing concern. The Americans were demonstrating that inferior aircraft could achieve superior results through better training, tactics, and coordination. More disturbing still, they were doing so with an airplane that German intelligence had dismissed as obsolescent 2 years earlier. While German pilots grudgingly learned to respect the P-40, their Japanese counterparts were receiving an even more shocking education in American fighter capabilities. The aircraft that Tokyo's planners had dismissed as inferior to their lightweight fighters was about to demonstrate that firepower and protection could triumph over speed and maneuverability. In the humid workshops of Nakajima Aircraft Company's Koizumi plant, engineers were conducting detailed examinations of a captured P-40E that had been forced down near Rangoon in early 1942. What they discovered challenged every assumption Japanese designers had made about fighter aircraft philosophy. The American fighter weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero when fully loaded, yet its Allison engine produced enough power to give it competitive performance at low altitude. More shocking was the aircraft's construction. Everything was built for survival rather than performance. The pilot sat behind thick armor plating, his fuel tanks were protected by self-sealing rubber, and his 650 caliber machine guns could deliver devastating firepower at ranges where Japanese cannon were ineffective. Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the legendary Zero fighter, studied photographs of the P-40's internal structure with professional fascination. This aircraft represents a completely different philosophy of air combat, he noted in his engineering diary. Where we have pursued maximum performance through weight reduction, the Americans have accepted performance penalties to maximize pilot survivability and firepower effectiveness. The Japanese evaluation team, led by Captain Minoru Genda of the Naval General Staff, recognized that the P-40 posed challenges their current fighter force was ill-equipped to address. Zero pilots had been trained to exploit their aircraft's superior maneuverability in turning engagements, But the American fighters' pilots seemed determined to avoid precisely those combat situations where Japanese advantages were most pronounced. Instead, P-40 pilots employed what Japanese analysts termed gangster tactics, diving attacks from superior altitude, followed by immediate disengagement. The American fighters would not turn and fight, denying Zero pilots the opportunity to bring their superior maneuverability to bear. Worse still, the P-40's superior diving speed meant that Japanese pilots could not pursue effectively once the Americans decided to disengage. This tactical revelation coincided with disturbing intelligence reports from the China-Burma-India theater, where American volunteer group pilots flying P-40B models were achieving unprecedented success rates against Japanese Army Air Force units. The AVG's kill-to-loss ratio of over 70-1 in air-to-air combat suggested that American tactics were far more effective than Japanese planners had anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Yasuhiko Kuro of the 64th Hiko Sentai provided one of the most detailed Japanese assessments of P-40 capabilities after multiple encounters over Burma in 1942. The American fighter is like a heavily armored samurai facing our lightly equipped Shigeru, he reported to Army Air Force headquarters. While our aircraft can dance around theirs, a single blow from their weapons is often fatal, while they can absorb many hits from our guns and continue fighting. Kuro's unit had learned this lesson the hard way during repeated engagements with flying Tiger P-40s over the Salween River Gorge. Japanese Army fighters, optimized for dogfighting, found themselves unable to exploit their maneuverability advantages against opponents who refused to engage in turning combat. The Americans would dive, fire a quick burst, and climb away before Japanese pilots could respond effectively. Even more frustrating was the P-40's apparent invulnerability to the 20mm cannon fire that had proven so effective against other Allied fighters. Time and again, Japanese pilots would score what appeared to be fatal hits on American fighters, only to watch their targets continue flying and fighting. The Hurricane and Buffalo fighters could be destroyed with relatively few cannon hits, but P-40s seemed to absorb tremendous damage while remaining airworthy. This durability became legendary among Japanese pilots, who began referring to P-40 pilots as Iron Men in Iron Coffins. The phrase reflected both respect for American pilot skill and frustration with the aircraft's ability to survive combat damage that would down any Japanese fighter. By late 1942, Japanese Army Air Force units were receiving specific tactical instructions for engaging P-40 fighters. Pilots were advised to avoid diving engagements where the American aircraft held advantages, instead seeking to force turning fights at low altitude where Zero and Oscar fighters could exploit their superior maneuverability. More importantly, Japanese fighters were instructed to attack in large formations, using numerical superiority to overwhelm the Americans' firepower advantage. These tactical adjustments reflected a fundamental shift in Japanese thinking about air combat. The early war period's emphasis on individual pilot skill and aircraft performance was giving way to recognition that superior tactics and coordinated attacks could overcome raw performance advantages. The ultimate validation of this new approach came during the fierce air battles over Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943, where Japanese Navy pilots flying Zero fighters achieved notable success against Marine Corps P-40 units. However, these victories came at a terrible cost in experienced pilots, losses that Japan could not afford to sustain while American industrial production was flooding the Pacific with new aircraft and trained aircrew. Perhaps the most remarkable Japanese assessment of the P-40 came from an unexpected source: captured American aircraft pressed into service with the 50th Hiko Sentai for the defense of Rangoon. In a development that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, Japanese pilots were actually flying American fighters against Allied bombers attacking Burma. Captain Yasuhiko Kuro, who had earlier provided detailed tactical assessments of P-40 capabilities, found himself assigned to fly one of these captured aircraft in early 1943. His subsequent report provided unique insights into the American fighter's characteristics from a Japanese pilot's perspective. The P-40 is like flying a heavily loaded transport aircraft compared to our fighters, Kuro noted. It requires completely different flying techniques. You cannot throw it around the sky like a Zero or Oscar. However, once you accept these limitations and fly to the aircraft's strengths, it becomes a formidable weapon. Kuro was particularly impressed by the P-40's stability as a gun platform and the devastating effectiveness of its 650 caliber machine guns. "Our 20mm cannon may have better range and hitting power per round," he reported, "but the Americans' 6 machine guns create a wall of fire that is almost impossible to fly through. The psychological effect on enemy pilots is as important as the physical damage." The Japanese experiment with captured P-40s ended in tragedy when one of the American fighters, misidentified as hostile, was shot down by Japanese ground forces over Rangoon. The pilot, ironically, was attempting to intercept Allied bombers attacking Japanese positions. This incident of mistaken identity highlighted the confusion surrounding aircraft recognition in the chaotic Burma theater, where captured and modified aircraft from both sides operated alongside conventional fighters. Despite their brief operational use of captured P-40s, Japanese intelligence continued to regard the American fighter as a significant threat throughout the war. Post-war interrogations of Japanese pilots revealed consistent respect for the aircraft's durability, firepower, and the tactical skill of its pilots, even as they maintained confidence in their own aircraft's superior maneuverability and rate of climb. While German and Japanese pilots were learning to respect the P-40 through bitter combat experience, their Italian allies were discovering that the American fighter posed an even more direct threat to Regia Aeronautica operations in the Mediterranean theater. The first Italian encounter with the P-40 came on June 8, 1941, when Flight Officer Jack Hamlin and Flight Sergeant Tom Paxton of the Royal Air Force's No. 250 Squadron intercepted a Kant Z-1007 bomber of the 211th Squadriglia over Alexandria, Egypt. The engagement lasted only minutes, but its outcome would prove prophetic for Italian air operations throughout the North African campaign. The Italian bomber, despite its defensive armament and experienced crew, proved helpless against the concentrated firepower of 2 Tomahawks attacking from different angles. Hamlin and Paxton's coordinated attack overwhelmed the Kant's defensive capabilities, sending the 3-engine bomber crashing into the Mediterranean in flames. All 6 crew members were killed, making this the first officially recognized P-40 victory in combat. News of the engagement reached Regia Aeronautica headquarters in Rome within hours, where intelligence officers struggled to assess the implications of this new Allied fighter. Initial reports suggested that the British had received an improved version of the Hurricane, but detailed examination of gun camera footage and pilot debriefs revealed that something entirely new had entered the North African theater. General di Squadra Area Francesco Priccolo, chief of the Italian Air Force General Staff, ordered immediate intelligence gathering on the new Allied aircraft. What Italian analysts discovered was deeply concerning. The Americans had apparently provided the British with a fighter that combined superior firepower with performance characteristics well suited to Mediterranean combat conditions. Unlike the Hurricane, which Italian pilots had learned to engage successfully through careful attention to altitude and speed management, the new American fighter seemed to excel in exactly those flight regimes where Italian aircraft performed best. The Macchi C-200 Setta and Fiat G-50 Freccia, Italy's primary fighter types, relied on superior maneuverability and climb rate to defeat Allied fighters in turning engagements. The P-40, however, possessed sufficient agility to hold its own in such encounters while bringing vastly superior firepower to bear. Major Giuseppe Santoro, commanding the 10th Gruppo Caccia equipped with Macchi C-200s, provided one of the first detailed Italian assessments of P-40 capabilities after a series of engagements over Libya in September 1941. The American fighter represents a significant escalation in Allied air capabilities, he reported to his superiors. While our aircraft retain advantages in certain flight conditions, the enemy's superior armament and protection make every engagement potentially fatal for our pilots. Santoro's assessment proved prescient as Italian units began encountering P-40s in increasing numbers throughout late 1941 and early 1942. The American fighter's 650 caliber machine guns could destroy Italian aircraft with brief firing bursts, while Italian pilots found their own armament, typically 2 12.7mm machine guns, insufficient to achieve quick kills against the heavily protected American aircraft. This firepower imbalance became particularly apparent during bomber escort missions, where Italian fighters were required to break up Allied bombing formations before they could reach their targets. Hurricane fighters, with their 8 rifle-caliber machine guns, could be driven off through aggressive attack, but P-40s seemed to absorb punishment while continuing to protect their charges. The situation improved somewhat with the introduction of the Macchi C-202 Folgore in mid-1942, powered by the German Daimler-Benz DB601 engine. This aircraft finally gave Italian pilots a fighter with performance competitive with the P-40 at most altitudes, though the American aircraft retained significant advantages in firepower and protection. Tenente Colonnello Mario Bonzano, one of Italy's leading fighter aces with 16 confirmed victories, flew both the C-200 and C-202 against P-40s over North Africa. His combat reports provide unique insights into the Italian perspective on American fighter capabilities during this crucial period of the war. The early P-40 models were formidable opponents for our set of fighters, Bonzano noted in his memoirs. Their superior firepower and protection made them dangerous in any engagement, while their pilots demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded anything we had encountered from the British. The Americans seemed to understand their aircraft's limitations and flew accordingly, never allowing us to exploit our advantages in turning performance. Bonzano was particularly impressed by the disciplined formation flying of American P-40 units, which began arriving in the Mediterranean theater in mid-1942. Unlike British Commonwealth pilots, who often engaged in individual combat, American fighters worked as coordinated teams, using superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm Italian defensive formations. The introduction of the improved C-202 Folgore allowed Italian pilots to engage P-40s on more equal terms, but by then the strategic situation had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. American industrial production was flooding the Mediterranean with new aircraft faster than Italy could replace its losses, while Allied pilot training programs were producing aircrew at unprecedented rates. By early 1943, with Axis forces retreating across North Africa, Italian fighter units found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outgunned by Allied air power. The P-40, which had entered combat as an supposedly obsolescent American fighter, had evolved into one of the primary instruments of Axis defeat in the Mediterranean theater. The final Italian assessment of P-40 capabilities came from General di Squadra Area Rino Corso Fuggier, who commanded Italian air operations in North Africa during the final phases of the campaign. The American P-40 proved to be one of the most effective Allied weapons in the Mediterranean, he wrote in his post-war analysis. While it may not have been the most advanced fighter of the war, it was perfectly suited to the conditions and requirements of North African combat. Its combination of firepower, protection, and tactical employment made it a formidable opponent that contributed significantly to our defeat. Perhaps the most unexpected international perspective on the P-40 came from Soviet pilots flying American-supplied fighters on the Eastern Front, where desperate conditions and innovative tactics would reveal capabilities that even the aircraft's designers hadn't anticipated. The first Lend-Lease Tomahawks arrived at the port of Murmansk in September 1941, crated and accompanied by British technical personnel who would assemble and test-fly the aircraft before turning them over to Soviet Air Force units. The 47 aircraft of this initial shipment represented a significant addition to Soviet fighter strength at a time when the Red Army was reeling from German advances on all fronts. Senior Lieutenant Stepan Ridny of the 126th Fighter Aviation Regiment was among the first Soviet pilots to fly the American fighter. A veteran of combat against both Finnish and German air forces, Ridny brought hard-earned experience to his evaluation of the P-40's combat potential. The Tomahawk is a different type of fighter from our I-16 or MiG-3, Ridny noted in his initial flight report. It is heavier and less maneuverable, but it possesses qualities that may prove valuable in our type of warfare. The pilot protection is excellent, and the firepower is devastating when properly employed. Ridny's assessment proved prophetic as Soviet P-40 units began engaging German fighters over the northern sector of the Eastern Front in October 1941. The American fighters' durability proved particularly valuable in the harsh conditions of the Russian winter, where aircraft were expected to operate in temperatures that would ground more delicate fighters. However, the P-40's first winter in Soviet service nearly ended in disaster. The aircraft's American specification fluids, engine oil, hydraulic fluid, and coolant proved completely inadequate for Russian winter conditions. At temperatures reaching -38°C, these fluids froze solid, causing catastrophic failures of vital aircraft systems. On 38 separate occasions, P-40 radiators burst due to freezing coolant, forcing Soviet maintenance crews to confiscate silver forks from nearby villages to provide solder for repairs. Tires cracked in the extreme cold, batteries failed, and generators seized up from congealed lubricants. The 126th IAP, as the first Soviet unit to operate Tomahawks, bore the brunt of solving these avalanche of defects, as one maintenance report described the winterization problems. Despite these difficulties, Soviet pilots quickly recognized the P-40's potential when properly employed. Major Vasily Golyabev, commanding the 126th IAP, developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the American fighter's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses in combat against German aircraft. "We discovered that the P-40 could not fight like a Russian fighter," Golyabev explained in his post-war memoirs. "It was too heavy and underpowered for traditional dogfighting tactics. However, when flown as a disciplined formation using coordinated attacks, it became a very dangerous opponent for German pilots." Soviet P-40 tactics emphasized teamwork and firepower concentration rather than individual aerial combat skills. Flights of 4 to 6 aircraft would approach German formations at high speed, deliver coordinated attacks using their superior firepower, then disengage before enemy fighters could respond effectively. This approach negated many of the Messerschmitt's advantages in climb rate and maneuverability while maximizing the P-40's strengths in firepower and structural durability. The effectiveness of these tactics became apparent during the defense of Leningrad, where Soviet P-40 units achieved notable success against experienced Luftwaffe fighter units. By spring 1942, the 126th IAP had claimed 29 German aircraft destroyed, while losing only 4 of their own P-40s and 2 pilots, a remarkable achievement given the experience level of their opponents. However, it was the innovations introduced by Soviet maintenance personnel that truly revealed the P-40's hidden potential. Unlike American or British units, which operated their fighters according to manufacturer specifications, Soviet mechanics treated the P-40 as raw material for improvement rather than a finished product. General Major Nikolai Golodnikov, who flew P-40s with the 2nd Guards Fighter Regiment defending Murmansk, provided detailed insights into Soviet modifications and operational techniques in post-war interviews. "We quickly learned that the American manual was written for peacetime conditions," Golodnikov explained. "In combat, we needed every possible advantage, so we began making changes. The most significant modification involved engine operation. Soviet pilots routinely flew their P-40s at increased RPM settings well beyond American specifications, accepting shortened engine life in exchange for improved acceleration and combat performance. We always flew at increased RPM," Golodnikov noted. "Fighter aviation is not about preserving engines. It is about destroying the enemy and staying alive." This aggressive engine management, combined with removal of wing-mounted guns to save weight, transformed the P-40's performance characteristics. Soviet pilots reported that properly modified aircraft could accelerate quickly enough to catch German fighters before their superior top speed could pull them out of engagement range. The weight reduction program went far beyond removing wing guns. Soviet mechanics stripped their P-40s of non-essential equipment, including radios in some cases, to achieve maximum performance improvement. "We took from the machine everything possible," Golodnikov explained. How much everything was, it was not written in manuals, and even airplane designers didn't anticipate. This appears in combat. Soviet pilots also developed innovative combat techniques that exploited the P-40's unique characteristics. The aircraft's excellent stability as a gun platform made it ideal for ground attack missions, while its structural strength allowed it to survive damage that would destroy lighter fighters. Some units employed their P-40s as light bombers, carrying Soviet-made bombs on improvised racks fabricated by field workshops. Perhaps most remarkably, Soviet units achieved A status for several pilots flying P-40s, despite the aircraft's reputation for poor performance compared to contemporary fighters. Lieutenant Dmitry Koval of the 45th IAP shot down 6 German aircraft while flying a P-40 on the North Caucasian front, while Boris Safonov, the Soviet Union's leading naval ace, achieved multiple kills in American fighters before his death in combat. The Soviet experience with the P-40 demonstrated that aircraft performance was as much about tactics and maintenance as raw specifications. Through innovative modifications and aggressive operational techniques, Soviet pilots extracted performance levels from the American fighter that surprised even its designers. By war's end, The Soviet Union had operated over 2,400 P-40s of various models, making them one of the largest international users of the aircraft. Soviet assessments consistently rated the P-40 as superior to the Hurricane and competitive with German fighters when properly employed, though inferior to later Soviet designs like the Yak-9 and La-5. The Soviet P-40 experience provided valuable lessons for post-war fighter development, demonstrating that pilot protection, firepower, and structural durability were often more important than raw performance in determining combat effectiveness. These lessons would influence Soviet fighter design philosophy for decades after the war's end. While pilots around the world were discovering the P-40's combat potential, the aircraft's remarkable story was also being written in the industrial heartland of America, where unprecedented production efforts were turning a single factory complex into the world's largest fighter manufacturing center. The Curtiss Corporation's main production facility in Buffalo, New York, occupied over 3 million square feet of factory space along the shores of Lake Erie. By 1941, this sprawling complex had become the epicenter of American fighter production, employing nearly 30,000 workers in round-the-clock operations designed to meet the desperate needs of Allied air forces worldwide. Margaret O'Brien arrived at the Buffalo plant on a cold February morning in 1941, one of thousands of women entering aircraft production for the first time as America's industrial mobilization accelerated. A former department store clerk, O'Brien had never seen the inside of a factory, much less worked on military aircraft. Within 6 months, she would become one of the plant's most skilled wing assembly specialists, contributing to the production of fighters that would determine the outcome of battles on every continent. The first day was overwhelming, O'Brien recalled in a post-war interview. The noise was incredible: riveting guns, metal presses, overhead cranes moving aircraft components around the clock. But there was also an energy, a sense of urgency that made everyone understand we were part of something much larger than ourselves. The Buffalo plant's production line represented a marvel of industrial organization, with partially completed P-40s moving through a carefully choreographed sequence of assembly stations. Each aircraft began as raw aluminum sheets and forgings delivered by railroad from suppliers across the industrial Midwest, then progressed through cutting, forming, assembly, and final testing in a process that took approximately 6 weeks from start to finish. Joseph Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who had worked as a machinist in Buffalo's steel industry, found himself responsible for manufacturing the complex aluminum forgings that formed the P-40's engine mount. His small section produced over 50 engine mounts per day, each one precision machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Every piece had to be perfect, Kowalski explained. We knew that pilots' lives depended on our work, so there was no room for shortcuts or mistakes. The company had quality control inspectors checking everything, but most of us took personal responsibility for ensuring our work met the highest standards. The complexity of P-40 production became apparent when examining the supply chain that fed the Buffalo plant. The aircraft's Allison V-1710 engine was manufactured at General Motors facilities in Indianapolis, then shipped to Buffalo by railroad. Propellers came from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut, while instruments and radios were produced by dozens of specialized suppliers across the country. Managing this supply chain required unprecedented coordination between government agencies and private manufacturers. The War Production Board allocated raw materials, the Office of Defense Transportation coordinated shipping, and the Army Air Forces provided technical specifications and quality control oversight. Any disruption in this carefully balanced system could halt P-40 production within days. The plant's most dramatic production challenge came during the winter of 1941 to 1942, when British and Soviet Lend-Lease orders pushed demand beyond the Buffalo facility's maximum capacity. Factory space was at a premium, with assembly lines extended into temporary buildings and even outdoor areas where weather permitted. Life magazine photographer Dmitry Kessel documented this extraordinary period in a series of color photographs that captured the controlled chaos of maximum production. His images showed workers assembling P-40 components in sub-zero temperatures, their breath visible in the unheated temporary structures where wing assemblies were mated to fuselages. "We were working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day," recalled Eleanor Thompson, who supervised a team of women installing instrument panels in P-40 cockpits. The company provided cots in unused office space so workers could rest between shifts without going home. It sounds impossible now, but at the time it felt like the most important thing we could do for the war effort. The pressure to increase production led to remarkable innovations in manufacturing technique. Traditional aircraft assembly methods, which relied heavily on skilled craftsmen working on individual components, gave way to assembly line techniques adapted from automobile production. Workers became specialists in specific tasks, dramatically increasing efficiency while reducing the skill level required for many assembly operations. One of the most innovative features of P-40 production was the special truck rig system developed to transport aircraft between the main factory and Buffalo Airport 8 miles away. Complete P-40s were too large to move by road fully assembled, so Curtiss engineers designed a transport system that carried aircraft in two main components, the fuselage and wing assembly, which were then mated at the airport for final flight testing. This system allowed the company to maintain separate facilities for manufacturing and flight testing while maximizing the use of limited factory space in downtown Buffalo. Each day, dozens of trucks carried P-40 components through the city streets, their unusual cargo drawing crowds of spectators who gathered to watch the latest fighters heading for final assembly. Flight testing represented the final crucial step in P-40 production, with company test pilots conducting comprehensive evaluations of each aircraft before acceptance by military authorities. Chief Test Pilot H. Lloyd Child flew over 3,000 P-40s during the war, more than any other individual, and his flight reports provided crucial feedback for ongoing production improvements. Every aircraft was slightly different, Child explained in his memoirs. Manufacturing tolerances, engine variations, and assembly differences meant that no two P-40s flew exactly alike. Our job was to identify any problems before the aircraft reached operational units, where pilot lives would depend on proper functioning of every system. Child's test flights revealed numerous production issues that might otherwise have gone undetected until combat operations exposed them. Fuel system problems, electrical malfunctions, and control surface irregularities were identified and corrected before aircraft left the Buffalo facility, preventing potentially fatal failures in operational service. The human cost of this unprecedented production effort was significant. Industrial accidents were common in the high-pressure environment of wartime manufacturing, with workers operating dangerous machinery for extended periods under extreme time pressure. The Buffalo plant recorded over 2,000 industrial accidents during 1942 alone, though most were minor injuries that didn't prevent workers from returning to their jobs. More seriously, the intense pace of production took a psychological toll on workers who understood that their efforts directly affected the survival of combat pilots. Letters from P-40 pilots in combat zones were regularly shared with factory workers, creating a personal connection between manufacturers and users that added emotional weight to an already stressful work environment. We received a letter from a Flying Tiger pilot who credited his survival to the quality of his P-40, recalled assembly line supervisor Frank Kowalski. He'd been shot up over Burma but made it back to base because his aircraft held together. Reading that letter to my team was one of the most emotional moments of the war. It made everyone understand why we were pushing ourselves so hard. By the end of 1944, the Buffalo plant had produced over 13,000 P-40s, representing one of the largest single-location aircraft production runs in history. The achievement required the coordinated efforts of over 180,000 workers throughout the Curtiss organization, supported by thousands of suppliers and subcontractors across the American industrial base. The plant's production record stood as testimony to American industrial capability, but it also reflected the human sacrifice of workers who dedicated years of their lives to ensuring that Allied pilots had the aircraft they needed to win the war. When P-40 production ended in November 1944, it marked not only the conclusion of a remarkable manufacturing achievement, but also the transformation of American industry from peacetime to wartime production and back again. While American factories were producing P-40s by the thousands, the aircraft's most famous operators were writing their own chapter of aviation history in the skies over China and Burma, where a small group of American volunteers would demonstrate that superior tactics and aggressive leadership could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The American Volunteer Group officially came into existence on July 4, 1941, when 99 P-40B fighters were assembled at Taungoo Airfield in Burma under the command of retired U.S. Army Air Corps Captain Claire Lee Chennault. These aircraft, originally built for Britain's Royal Air Force, had been diverted to China through complex negotiations that allowed the Chinese government to purchase American fighters before the United States officially entered the war. Chennault, who had spent 4 years in China as an advisor to the Chinese Air Force, understood better than any American the tactical challenges posed by Japanese air power in the China-Burma-India theater. Japanese fighters possessed significant advantages in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, while their pilots had accumulated combat experience over China since 1937. American volunteers flying unfamiliar aircraft in hostile territory faced overwhelming odds against experienced opponents operating from established bases. The solution, Chennault realized, lay not in trying to outturn Japanese fighters, but in developing tactics that exploited the P-40's unique advantages while avoiding situations where enemy aircraft could bring their superior characteristics to bear. This tactical revolution would transform air combat not only in the CBI theater but throughout the Pacific War. First Lieutenant David Lee Tex Hill, a former U.S. Navy dive bomber pilot from Texas, arrived at Taungoo in August 1941, expecting to fly familiar aircraft using conventional tactics. Instead, he found himself learning to operate a fighter he'd never seen before, using techniques that contradicted everything he'd been taught about air combat. Chennault's first lecture shocked everyone, Hill recalled in his post-war memoirs. He told us to forget everything we'd learned about dogfighting. The P-40 couldn't turn with Japanese fighters, so we weren't going to try. Instead, we would use our advantages, superior firepower, better protection, and higher diving speed, to develop entirely new tactics. Chennault's tactical doctrine, developed through careful analysis of Japanese aircraft capabilities and combat reports, emphasized altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, and immediate disengagement after firing passes. P-40 pilots were trained to approach Japanese formations from above, dive through enemy fighters while firing concentrated bursts, then continue diving to build up speed for escape. Under no circumstances were they to engage in sustained turning combats where Japanese fighters held decisive advantages. This hit-and-run approach required precise timing, excellent marksmanship, and iron discipline. Pilots had to resist the natural impulse to pursue damaged enemy aircraft or engage in individual combat, instead maintaining formation integrity and following predetermined attack patterns regardless of immediate tactical opportunities. Robert H. Neal, a former U.S. Navy pilot commanding the AVG's First Squadron, implemented Chennault's tactical concepts through intensive training that emphasized formation flying and coordinated attacks. We practiced the same attack patterns over and over until they became automatic, Neal explained. When we encountered Japanese fighters in combat, there was no time to think about tactics. Everything had to be reflexive. The effectiveness of these tactics became apparent on December 20th, 1941, when 10 Japanese bombers approached Kunming escorted by 25 fighters. 4 AVG P-40s, led by squadron leader Arvid Olsen, intercepted the formation using Chennault's prescribed tactics. Olsen's flight approached the Japanese formation from 20,000 feet, diving through the escort fighters to attack the bombers from astern. The concentrated firepower of 4 P-40s armed with 650 caliber machine guns each proved devastating. 4 bombers were destroyed in the initial pass, while the remaining aircraft jettisoned their bombs and fled toward their bases in Thailand. More importantly, the engagement demonstrated that properly executed tactics could neutralize Japanese numerical superiority. Despite being outnumbered over 8-1, the AVG pilots achieved complete tactical success without losing a single aircraft. Japanese fighter escorts, optimized for dogfighting, proved ineffective against opponents who refused to engage in turning combat. Word of the Kunming engagement spread rapidly through Japanese air units operating over China, Burma, and Thailand. For the first time since the China incident began in 1937, Japanese pilots faced opponents who seemed immune to traditional fighter tactics. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical implications. Flight Sergeant Kenji Shimada of the 3rd Air Regiment, Japanese Army Air Force, participated in several unsuccessful attempts to engage AVG fighters during early 1942. His combat diary provides rare insights into Japanese pilot reactions to Chenault's tactical innovations. The American volunteers fight like no opponent we have previously encountered, Shimada wrote. They will not be drawn into individual combat where our superior aircraft can defeat them. Instead, they appear suddenly from above, strike with devastating firepower, then disappear before we can respond. It is like fighting ghosts who strike and vanish. Shimada's assessment reflected growing Japanese frustration with an opponent who refused to fight according to accepted air combat conventions. Japanese pilots, trained for close-in combat using their aircraft's superior maneuverability, found themselves helpless against opponents who maintained energy and altitude advantages through superior tactical discipline. The AVG's tactical success was amplified by its pilots' remarkable accuracy with the P-40's 650 caliber machine guns. Unlike Japanese fighters, which typically carried two 20mm cannon with limited ammunition, the American fighters could deliver sustained firepower that was devastating against lightly constructed enemy aircraft. Charles Older, a former U.S. Army Air Corps pilot with the AVG's 3rd Squadron, achieved ace status through precise gunnery that exemplified Chenault's tactical philosophy. The key was getting close enough to make every shot count, Older explained. Japanese fighters were lightly built, so accurate fire from our 650s could destroy them with short bursts. But you had to be disciplined, get in close, fire accurately, then get out fast. Older's success was typical of AVG pilots, who achieved remarkable accuracy rates despite flying unfamiliar aircraft under combat conditions. This precision reflected intensive training in aerial gunnery techniques specifically adapted to the P-40's characteristics and Chenault's tactical requirements. The AVG's growing effectiveness prompted Japanese air commanders to develop countermeasures designed to neutralize American tactical advantages. These included flying at higher altitudes to reduce the Americans' energy advantage, using larger formations to overwhelm P-40 flights through sheer numbers, and attempting to force engagements over Japanese-controlled territory where damaged American fighters could not reach friendly bases. None of these countermeasures proved effective against properly executed AVG tactics. American pilots maintained tactical discipline even when facing overwhelming odds, refusing to be drawn into unfavorable engagements regardless of immediate tactical opportunities or perceived advantages. The psychological impact of AVG success extended far beyond the China-Burma-India theater. News of American volunteers achieving unprecedented kill ratios against experienced Japanese pilots provided a crucial morale boost for Allied forces reeling from disasters in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The Flying Tigers, as they became known to the international press, represented proof that Japanese air power could be defeated by superior tactics and training. By July 1942, when the AVG was formally disbanded and its remaining personnel transferred to the U.S. Army Air Force's 23rd Fighter Group, the unit had claimed 297 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat while losing only 4 P-40s to enemy fighters. This extraordinary kill-to-loss ratio of over 70-1 represented the most successful fighter unit record of the entire war. More importantly, the AVG had demonstrated that the P-40, despite its technical limitations, could serve as the foundation for air superiority when properly employed by well-trained pilots using sound tactical doctrine. Chenault's tactical innovations would be adopted by P-40 units throughout the Pacific, fundamentally changing the nature of fighter combat against Japanese air forces. The lessons learned by the Flying Tigers proved equally valuable in the Southwest Pacific, where General Douglas MacArthur's air forces faced similar challenges in developing effective tactics against experienced Japanese opponents operating advanced fighter aircraft. The 5th Air Force's introduction to combat in the Southwest Pacific area began under circumstances that seemed to validate every pessimistic assessment of the P-40's combat potential. On February 19, 1942, 188 Japanese carrier aircraft struck Darwin, Australia, in the largest air raid ever mounted against Australian territory. The town's defense rested on 8 P-40E fighters of the 49th Fighter Group, 9th Fighter Squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Buzz Wagner, the same officer who had become America's first ace while flying P-40s in the Philippines campaign. Wagner's pilots faced impossible odds against experienced Japanese naval aviators flying Zero fighters from 4 aircraft carriers positioned in the Timor Sea. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the P-40's limitations and its potential when properly employed under favorable tactical conditions. 5 American fighters were shot down in the initial Japanese attack, but the surviving P-40s, flown by pilots who understood Chennault's tactical principles, managed to disrupt the Japanese formation and shoot down several enemy aircraft. Staff Sergeant Floyd Pell, flying P-40E serial number 41368081, used energy management techniques learned from flying Tiger combat reports to engage a formation of 0 fighters attacking Darwin's airfield. Rather than turning to fight, Pell dove through the Japanese formation at maximum speed, firing brief bursts that damaged 2 enemy aircraft before climbing away to safety. "I remembered what we'd heard about the Flying Tigers never turning to fight," Pell explained in his after-action report. "The Zeros were faster and more maneuverable, so I had to use speed and altitude to survive. It worked. I got my shots in and got away clean." Pell's survival, along with that of 2 other American pilots, proved that P-40 tactics developed in China could be successfully adapted to Pacific conditions. More importantly, it demonstrated that properly trained pilots could achieve tactical success even when facing overwhelming numerical odds and superior enemy aircraft. The lessons of Darwin led to intensive tactical training throughout 5th Air Force P-40 units, with emphasis on energy management, formation flying, and coordinated attacks. Pilots studied flying Tiger combat reports, practiced Chennault's tactical principles, and developed Southwest Pacific-specific techniques for engaging Japanese fighters under local conditions. Major Robert Westbrook, commanding the 9th Fighter Squadron after Wagner's reassignment, implemented training programs that emphasized tactical discipline and accurate gunnery over individual dogfighting skills. "We couldn't outturn the Japanese," Westbrook noted, "but we could outshoot them if we used proper tactics and maintained formation integrity." Westbrook's training methods proved effective during the crucial air battles over Port Moresby in April and May 1942, when 5th Air Force P-40 units faced sustained Japanese attacks designed to neutralize Allied air power in New Guinea. Despite being outnumbered and operating from primitive airfields, American pilots achieved notable success against experienced Japanese Army and Navy air units. The key to American success lay in exploiting the P-40's advantages while avoiding situations where Japanese fighters could bring their superior characteristics to bear. P-40 pilots learned to use their aircraft's superior diving speed to initiate and break off engagements, while their heavy armament proved devastating against lightly constructed Japanese fighters. Captain Richard Bong, who would later become America's leading ace flying P-38 Lightning fighters, began his combat career flying P-40s with the 9th Fighter Squadron in late 1942. His early combat reports provide valuable insights into the evolution of American fighter tactics in the Southwest Pacific. "The P-40 taught me everything I needed to know about energy management and tactical discipline," Bong explained in a post-war interview. "You couldn't make mistakes and survive. Every engagement had to be planned and executed perfectly. That training served me well when I transitioned to the P-38. Bong's success in the P-40, he achieved several kills before transitioning to the Lightning, reflected the aircraft's value as a training platform for pilots who would later fly more advanced fighters. The tactical discipline required for P-40 operations proved excellent preparation for pilots destined for high-performance aircraft like the P-38 and P-51. As American fighter tactics evolved throughout 1942 and early 1943, P-40 units in the Southwest Pacific began achieving increasingly favorable exchange ratios against Japanese opponents. The aircraft that had seemed hopelessly outclassed in early war engagements was becoming a formidable weapon when properly employed. The transformation of P-40 effectiveness reached its peak during the massive air battles over Wewak, New Guinea, in August 1943, when American fighters achieved one of the most decisive air superiority victories of the Pacific War. 5th Air Force P-40s, fighting alongside P-38s and Australian fighters, destroyed over 100 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 20 of their own. The Wewak engagement demonstrated that the P-40 had evolved from a stopgap fighter into an integral component of American air superiority in the Pacific. While newer and more capable aircraft were beginning to replace it in frontline units, the lessons learned flying P-40s had fundamentally changed American approaches to fighter combat. Perhaps most importantly, P-40 operations in the Southwest Pacific proved that aircraft performance alone did not determine combat effectiveness. Proper tactics, intensive training, and tactical discipline could overcome significant technical disadvantages, transforming allegedly obsolescent fighters into war-winning weapons systems. The human stories behind these tactical innovations provide the most compelling evidence of the P-40's impact on American fighter development. Pilots who learned their craft in P-40 cockpits carried those lessons into more advanced aircraft, creating a generation of fighter pilots whose tactical sophistication was unmatched by any air force in the world. Among the most remarkable of these individual stories was that of Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding officer of the 348th Fighter Group, who achieved ace status flying P-40NS before transitioning to P-47 Thunderbolts. Kirby's combat career illustrated how lessons learned in supposedly obsolescent fighters could be applied to achieve unprecedented success in more advanced aircraft. Kirby arrived in the Southwest Pacific in May 1943 with extensive experience as a test pilot and gunnery instructor, but no previous combat experience. His first operational assignment was flying P-40N fighters from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, where he would encounter some of the most experienced Japanese fighter pilots in the Pacific theater. The P-40 was not the fastest or most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific, Kirby wrote to his wife after his first combat mission. But it was tough, reliable, and deadly accurate when properly flown. More importantly, it taught you to think tactically, to use every advantage available while avoiding situations where the enemy could exploit your weaknesses. Kirby's approach to P-40 operations emphasized careful mission planning, precise formation flying, and conservative tactics that maximized the aircraft's strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities. His first kill, a Zero fighter shot down over Bougainville in July 1943, demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined tactical approaches against even the most maneuverable enemy fighters. The engagement occurred when Kirby's flight of 4 P-40NS encountered 8 Zero fighters escorting Japanese bombers attacking Allied positions on Bougainville. Rather than engaging in turning combat, Kirby led his flight in a coordinated diving attack that scattered the Japanese formation while allowing accurate gunnery against individual enemy aircraft. "We approached from above and behind, maintaining formation integrity throughout the attack," Kirby noted in his combat report. "The concentrated firepower of 4 P-40s proved devastating. We destroyed 3 enemy fighters in the initial pass without taking any damage ourselves." Kirby's tactical success reflected broader improvements in American fighter pilot training and operational doctrine. By mid-1943, P-40 pilots were receiving comprehensive instruction in energy management, formation tactics, and coordinated attacks before deploying to combat theaters. This training emphasized tactical discipline and teamwork over individual dogfighting skills, producing pilots who fought as coordinated teams rather than individual warriors. The effectiveness of this training became apparent during the massive air battles over Bougainville in late 1943, when American P-40 units achieved decisive victories against elite Japanese fighter units despite flying allegedly inferior aircraft. These engagements demonstrated that superior training and tactics could overcome significant technical disadvantages. Captain Robert de Haven of the 49th Fighter Group achieved ace status flying P-40NS over New Guinea and the Philippines, earning a reputation as one of the most skilled fighter pilots in the Southwest Pacific. His combat techniques exemplified the tactical sophistication that American pilots had developed through bitter experience against Japanese opponents. Success in the P-40 required constant situational awareness and tactical discipline, de Haven explained in a post-war interview. "You had to know where every enemy fighter was at all times, maintain proper formation position, and execute coordinated attacks precisely. There was no room for improvisation or individual heroics." De Haven's 14 confirmed victories while flying P-40s illustrated the aircraft's continued effectiveness even as more advanced fighters became available. His techniques, careful altitude management, coordinated team attacks, and immediate disengagement after firing passes, became standard doctrine for American fighter units throughout the Pacific. The culmination of P-40 tactical development came during the Philippines campaign of 1944 to 1945, when American fighters achieved complete air superiority despite facing desperate Japanese resistance. P-40 units, though increasingly replaced by P-47s and P-51s, continued to play crucial roles in ground attack missions that supported MacArthur's island-hopping strategy. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commanding the 475th Fighter Group, led P-40 operations during the crucial Leyte campaign, where American air power proved decisive in preventing Japanese naval forces from interfering with MacArthur's landing operations. MacDonald's group flew both air-to-air and ground attack missions, demonstrating the P-40's versatility in combined operations. The P-40 had evolved into a true multi-role fighter by 1944, MacDonald observed. While it could still hold its own in air-to-air combat, its real value lay in ground attack missions where its firepower and durability proved invaluable. We could carry significant bomb loads, absorb ground fire, and return to base with battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. MacDonald's assessment reflected the P-40's evolution from pure fighter to fighter bomber, a role that would become increasingly important as American forces moved closer to Japan itself. The aircraft's ability to deliver both air-to-air and air-to-ground firepower made it ideally suited for the complex tactical requirements of amphibious operations. By the end of 1944, P-40 operations in the Southwest Pacific had established tactical doctrines and training methods that would influence American fighter development for decades. The lessons learned flying allegedly obsolescent fighters against experienced opponents had produced a generation of pilots whose tactical sophistication was unmatched by any air force in the world. These lessons extended far beyond the Pacific theater, influencing fighter operations in Europe, North Africa, and every other theater where American air power played decisive roles. The P-40, despite its technical limitations, had served as the foundation for American air superiority throughout World War II. As P-40 operations wound down in the Pacific, attention shifted to the aircraft's post-war fate and its lasting influence on fighter development. The lessons learned from 3 years of intensive combat operations would shape American tactical doctrine and aircraft design for the emerging jet age. The final chapter of the P-40's combat story was written not in the Pacific, but in the skies over China, where 14th Air Force units continued flying the aircraft until Japan's surrender in August 1945. These final operations demonstrated that the P-40 remained an effective weapon system even as more advanced aircraft became available. Major John Hampshire of the 75th Fighter Squadron achieved ace status flying P-40NS over China in 1944, earning recognition as one of the leading American pilots in the China-Burma-India theater. His 13 confirmed victories illustrated the continued effectiveness of Chennault's tactical principles even against improved Japanese fighter aircraft. The Japanese never developed effective countermeasures against properly executed P-40 tactics, Hampshire noted in his final combat report. Individual Japanese pilots became more skilled and their aircraft improved, but their tactical doctrine remained focused on individual combat rather than coordinated team attacks. This gave us a decisive advantage that we exploited throughout the war. Hampshire's assessment proved prophetic as American fighter tactics continued to evolve in the post-war period. The lessons learned flying P-40's emphasis on teamwork, tactical discipline, and coordinated attacks became fundamental principles of American fighter doctrine in the jet age. The P-40's influence extended beyond tactical development to aircraft design philosophy. American fighters developed during the war the P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang, and P-61 Black Widow, all reflected design priorities established by P-40 combat experience. These included pilot protection, heavy armament, structural durability, and reliability under combat conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the P-40 demonstrated that aircraft effectiveness depended as much on pilot training and tactical employment as raw performance specifications. This lesson influenced American military aviation throughout the Cold War period, emphasizing comprehensive pilot training and sophisticated tactical doctrine over reliance on superior aircraft performance alone. The end of P-40 production in November 1944 marked the conclusion of one of the most successful fighter programs in aviation history. 13,738 aircraft had been manufactured, equipping air forces on every continent and in every major theater of World War II. More significantly, the P-40 had achieved something no performance specification could measure. It had bought time for American industry to develop and produce the advanced fighters that would ultimately win the war. During the critical period from 1941 to 1943, When American industrial mobilization was still building momentum, the P-40 held the line against experienced enemy air forces operating superior aircraft. The human cost of this achievement was significant. Hundreds of P-40 pilots gave their lives learning the tactical lessons that would ensure victory for their successors. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Every lesson learned, every tactical innovation developed, every training method refined contributed to the ultimate achievement of air superiority against all Axis powers. The statistical record of P-40 operations tells only part of the story. Over 200 Allied pilots achieved ace status flying the aircraft, including some of the most famous names in aviation history. These men represented every Allied nation: American, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Soviet, and Chinese pilots all flew P-40s in combat. The international scope of P-40 operations created a unique community of fighter pilots who shared common experiences despite fighting in different theaters under different flags. Post-war reunions brought together former enemies and allies alike, all united by their respect for an aircraft that had demanded the best from everyone who flew it. General Curtiss LeMay, who commanded strategic bombing operations against Japan, provided perhaps the most fitting tribute to the P-40's wartime service. The P-40 may not have been the best fighter of World War II, LeMay observed, but it was the right fighter at the right time. It gave U.S. air superiority when we needed it most, and it taught American pilots the tactical skills they needed to win the war. LeMay's assessment reflected the broader military consensus about the P-40's role in Allied victory. While more advanced fighters achieved greater fame, the P-40 had provided the foundation upon which air superiority was built. Its pilots had learned the hard lessons of combat against experienced opponents, developing the tactical doctrines and training methods that would ensure American air power remained supreme throughout the war and beyond. The post-war fate of surviving P-40s reflected their international service record. Aircraft were distributed to air forces around the world, where they continued flying training and secondary missions well into the 1950s. Brazil operated P-40s until 1958, making them among the last piston-engine fighters in military service anywhere in the world. Museums and private collectors eventually acquired most surviving P-40s, where they serve as reminders of one of aviation history's most remarkable success stories. These aircraft represent more than obsolete military hardware. They embody the courage, skill, and determination of the pilots who flew them against impossible odds and achieved victory through superior tactics and training. The technical specifications that once seemed so disappointing: maximum speed of 334 miles per hour, service ceiling of 29,000 feet, armament of 650 caliber machine guns, proved perfectly adequate for the missions they were asked to perform. More importantly, the P-40's design philosophy of durability, reliability, and pilot protection established standards that continue to influence fighter development today. Modern fighter aircraft may fly at twice the speed of sound and carry guided missiles, but they still reflect design priorities first established by the P-40's combat experience. Pilot protection, structural durability, reliable systems, and heavy firepower remain fundamental requirements for any successful fighter aircraft, just as they were in 1941. The tactical lessons learned by P-40 pilots have similarly endured. Modern fighter pilots still study formation tactics, energy management, and coordinated attacks, the same principles that Claire Chennault developed for the Flying Tigers and that proved decisive throughout the Pacific War. The aircraft may have changed, but the fundamental principles of air combat remain constant. The P-40's greatest legacy, however, lies not in its technical specifications or tactical innovations, but in the men who flew it. These pilots proved that human skill and determination could overcome technical disadvantages, that proper training and tactics could defeat superior equipment, and that air superiority depended more on pilot quality than aircraft performance. This lesson resonated far beyond World War II, influencing American military aviation throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. The emphasis on comprehensive pilot training, sophisticated tactical doctrine, and coordinated operations that characterized P-40 units became hallmarks of American air power for generations of fighter pilots. Today, as military aviation enters the era of stealth technology, unmanned aircraft, and network-centric warfare, the lessons of the P-40 remain relevant. The aircraft that was dismissed as obsolescent proved that effectiveness depends more on how weapons are employed than on their raw performance capabilities. The story of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk thus represents more than the history of a single aircraft type. It illustrates the transformation of American military aviation from a peacetime force equipped with obsolete aircraft to the world's most capable air power. This transformation was achieved not through superior technology alone, but through the skill, courage, and tactical innovation of the pilots who flew whatever aircraft they were given and found ways to win. The men who climbed into P-40 cockpits in the dark days of 1941 faced impossible odds with inadequate equipment and little hope of survival. Through their sacrifice and skill, they not only survived but achieved victory against experienced opponents flying superior aircraft. Their legacy lives on in every American fighter pilot who has followed in their wake, carrying forward the tactical traditions and fighting spirit that first found expression in the cockpits of Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. In the final analysis, the Axis powers' surprise at P-40 effectiveness reflected their fundamental misunderstanding of air combat. They focused on aircraft performance while neglecting pilot training and tactical development. The Americans, forced to work with allegedly inferior equipment, developed superior pilots and tactics that proved decisive when the test of combat arrived. The P-40 Warhawk thus stands as testament to a fundamental truth of military aviation: wars are won not by the best aircraft, but by the best pilots flying whatever aircraft are available. The men who flew P-40s understood this truth and proved it in combat against every enemy they faced. Their victory was not just a triumph of American industrial production or aircraft design, but a victory of human skill, determination, and tactical innovation over apparently superior technology. This lesson, first learned in the skies over Pearl Harbor, Kunming, and Darwin, continues to influence military aviation today. The P-40's legacy lives on not in museums or air shows, but in the tactical doctrine, training methods, and fighting spirit of every fighter pilot who has followed in the wake of those first Americans who climbed into shark-mouthed fighters and proved that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. As air warfare continues to evolve in the 21st century, the story of the P-40 Warhawk reminds us that human factors remain the decisive element in military aviation. Technology may change, aircraft may become more sophisticated, and weapons may become more deadly, but the fundamental requirements for air superiority remain constant: skilled pilots, sound tactics, and the determination to fight and win regardless of the odds. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk embodied all of these qualities, transforming from an allegedly obsolescent fighter into one of history's most successful combat aircraft. Its pilots proved that, with proper training and tactics, any fighter could become deadly effective. That lesson, first learned over 70 years ago, remains as relevant today as it was when the first P-40s rolled off the production line in Buffalo, New York, ready to defend freedom against tyranny wherever the battle might lead. The aircraft that began as a compromise solution to urgent military requirements became the foundation of American air superiority in World War II. The pilots who flew it transformed from inexperienced civilians into the most tactically sophisticated fighter force in the world. Together, they proved that victory belongs not to those with the best equipment, but to those who make the best use of whatever tools they have available. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of the P-40 Warhawk, that human ingenuity, courage, and determination can overcome any technological disadvantage. The men who proved this lesson in the skies over China, Burma, North Africa, and the Pacific created a legacy that continues to inspire fighter pilots today, more than 7 decades after the last P-40 rolled off the production line in Buffalo. Their story reminds us that in warfare, as in life, victory belongs not to those who have the best equipment, but to those who make the best use of what they have. The P-40 Warhawk and the men who flew it proved this truth in the most decisive way possible, through victory in combat against impossible odds. That victory, and the lessons it taught, remain as relevant today as they were when America's entry into World War II hung in the balance, and a handful of pilots in shark-mouthed fighters held the line against tyranny. The Axis powers were indeed stunned when America's allegedly obsolete P-40 Warhawk produced over 200 aces and achieved air superiority in every theater where it served. But they should not have been surprised. The aircraft and its pilots embodied the best of American determination, ingenuity, and fighting spirit qualities that no amount of advanced technology could overcome. In the end, that was the real secret of the P-40's success and the foundation of America's victory in the greatest air war in history.